welcome to all of you. This is an exciting topic of conversation and the first of several that we're pleased to bring to you. This is a panel on climate migration, and we are very excited to be kicking off what will be the first in a series for the broader community, including those within the Truman National Security Project. I'm Kara Allen. I am your moderator for this evening's panel. I am a member of the Truman National Security Project class of 2018, political partner, and co-lead of Truman's Energy and Climate Group. I will note the panel is, this evening's panel is being recorded. We had a number of people reach out to us and indicate that they would be interested in a recording, even though they couldn't attend. So this evening is being recorded, and any materials that we reference in our discussion will be shared as a follow-up in addition to the recording. So again, with thanks to all of you for joining us this evening, and with a very special thanks to all of the panelists for participating, we are very fortunate to have such an esteemed panel with us. The topic tonight on climate migration, this, as I mentioned, is the first in a series about climate migration. This is really the beginning and designed to be an overview of climate migration and its complexities. We will have time for Q&A, so please do pop your questions into the Q&A box as they come to you. I will take those and read them with our panel, and hopefully we will have time to address all of your Q&A, but if not, we'll look forward to future discussions as this series continues. With that, I'm now going to turn it over to this outstanding panel to give a brief introduction as to themselves and where they are working now and how they came to find themselves interested in the topic of climate migration. So with that, we'll start with Dr. Bronen.
Hi, everyone. Afternoon here in Alaska. I work as the co-founder and executive director of the Alaska Institute for Justice. And we are the only nonprofit in Alaska that actually provides immigration legal representation. My background is as an immigration attorney. I also started the refugee resettlement program in Alaska. And for the last 16 years, I've been working with Indigenous communities, Alaska Native communities, that are being forced to relocate because of the climate crisis. And I use my legal skills, and I also have a doctorate, an interdisciplinary social science degree to address the issues that they are faced with. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bronen. Next, and yes, I will, I'll let you introduce yourself, Siders, so everyone knows that you prefer to go by your last name.
Yeah, so I'm A.R. Siders. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Delaware. I'm also a lawyer and an interdisciplinary social scientist. And at the university, I primarily study managed retreat and coastal climate change adaptation. And I do go by my last name. So you'll hear other panelists refer to me as Siders. That's by choice. Yes.
Great, thank you, Siders. Now, Mark.
Great, thank you, Kara, and thank you, Truman, for hosting this important discussion. Mark Nevin, I'm an associate professor of law at Syracuse University College of Law. We're still a few years away, I think, from the climate migration facing us, but it's coming. I teach in the areas of climate change adaptation, national security, environmental law, and most importantly, I'm a longtime Truman Defense Council member.
Thanks, Mark. And Susie.
Hi, good evening, everybody. My name is Susie Haslett. I am the Director of Immigration Capacity Building at Forward.us. Forward.us is a national advocacy organization aimed at, justice for immigrants and also for folks who have been incarcerated. And so the interesting intersection that sort of brings me here tonight is that our work up until I think the last 3 years didn't primarily focus on asylum as a key core of its efforts, but because of the zero tolerance policy and the many policy changes that have made it harder for folks to lawfully migrate. We have been involved with a number of organizations across the border who are, daily servicing directly and through legal services the needs of those who are seeking asylum in the United States.
Great. Thank you all. And I should also give a special shout out and thanks to one Camille Mackler. She is the Truman she's behind the Truman that you see on your screen. And she is one of a kind, but she is the force behind bringing tonight's panel together. And we are supremely grateful for her and for her fellowship within the Truman community as a senior visiting fellow on immigration. So thank you, Camille. With that, let's dive in. So we want to start tonight's discussion by defining the problem of climate migration. And so to start that off, I will ask my first question of Dr. Bronen. Dr. Bronen, would you begin by describing some of the pertinent climate change projections and why these changes would lead to forced or planned migration or displacement?
Yes, thank you. So as I just mentioned, I live in the Arctic. And the Arctic is increasing its temperatures more than twice as fast as the lower latitudes. And I apologize if my microphone, I can see it's going up and down. So I have the challenges of the internet. And it's really important to understand that if you're familiar with the Paris Agreement and the Paris Agreement's aspirational hope to keep our temperature increases to 1.5 degrees Celsius, 2 degrees Celsius for the outer limit of what our planet can tolerate in regard to the habitability of the places where we live. In the Arctic, we have far surpassed 2 degrees Celsius. And in preparation for this panel, I was looking at what happened just this past winter in Alaska. And this past winter in Alaska in February, so for those of you who don't know, in the Arctic, the sun doesn't rise in the wintertime. So the sun barely rises above the horizon. And yet in February, our temperatures were 11 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 degrees Celsius above the norm. And this is not an anomaly. For the last several years, temperature increases have been more than 2 degrees Celsius above the norm in the heart of winter. And for those of you who understand that 1 degree makes the difference between melting and thawing, it has been above freezing temperatures in the middle of wintertime, which has drastically increased the melting of the Greenland ice sheet. It is diminishing Arctic sea ice extent. And because of that, permafrost is also thawing, leading to accelerated rates of erosion so that communities along the western coast of Alaska are not able to remain in the places where they live.
That's staggering. I was in Alaska and Anchorage when the record temperatures hit. I guess this was now 2 years ago almost, in July, over the July 4th weekend. And it was the same temperature in Anchorage that it was in Miami. So those are real. But then to your point, Dr. Bronen, you're seeing it even in the winter when there isn't that constant sunlight.
And I would offer too with Dr. Bronen, because I'm so glad to have an Arctic voice here. Sometimes the climate science is issued or released as sort of an aggregate, an average, but it's anything but that. It's the temperature increase is quite different depending on what part of the world you are, and also the pace. And that has a follow-on cascading effect for the impacts. And I think one of the themes of this evening, I think, might be that those with the fewest resources often feel the climate effects most acutely. And so sometimes people say 1 degree Celsius is hard to wrap your head around. Just know that it's quite dramatic, and it varies quite a bit depending on where you are, and those impacts are felt disproportionately.
Great. Others want to add anything to that?
Well, if I could just add one thing, because of the accelerating climate crisis, the work that we've done with the tribes, We identified with them a new hazard in our state. It's part of our Alaska Hazard Mitigation Plan, and it's called UStek, which is spelled USTEQ. It means catastrophic land collapse, and it is being caused by the collision of erosion, thawing permafrost, and flooding. Because erosion does not describe what is happening in the Arctic, it is really the land collapse that is happening throughout the Arctic because of this collision of these environmental hazards that I just mentioned.
I think that's really important to think about. You noted this already, Robin, but to hit it home again, like these small changes and averages have huge catastrophic changes in the way that people experience them, right? So we tend to think about 1 or 2 degrees, and I've heard a lot of people say like, I can live with that. But the problem isn't that 1 or 2 degrees change in average, the median, it's that it makes these extremes so much more extreme, right? A little bit warmer means that we're that much likely, like you think about the hottest day you've ever experienced in your life, and that will become the norm, right? And the coldest day you've ever experienced, and you will never see that again. And that's what it means to shift a little bit in the average. And that just small changes in the average can really upset systems like the Arctic that have been so balanced for so many millennia. And so it's really pushing things out of balance, and it's those small changes in the average that lead to those really catastrophic changes at the margins that are important to think about.
Indeed, those are incredibly important. And I think sometimes another thing that may get lost in talking about the science of climate change is just what that impact actually means on the ground to specific parts of the system, and certainly to people. Mark, as you had mentioned, that these impacts will be felt most acutely by those who are in the position of being able to do the least about them. And so with that, I want to turn to Susie. Because Susie, you work day in and day out with people who are migrating away from their homes for a variety of reasons. And so would you help us understand what is currently driving some of the internal displacement of people moving away from their homes within their country or choosing to cross the border and move elsewhere? How do you see a changing climate altering those patterns?
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think one of the things that feels interesting, even if I can be transparent with the audience here, that is even the discussion of climate change within sort of the formal structures and systems that currently exist feels like a very new discussion, right? In the sense of just thinking about the kinds of ways in which our immigration system or asylum system are currently structured to respond, really don't meet the reality or don't meet the kind of existing challenges and circumstances that climate change is in many ways accelerating and causing this kind of internal displacement or ultimately the choice to migrate to other countries. So all that said, I think what I want to do is take a little bit of a step back to give a little sense of kind of my own learning journey in this. And as Kara mentioned, a lot of the work that I've done has actually been, in direct concert with a lot of organizations throughout the southern U.S.-Mexico border. And for me, where my interest was really piqued was directly tied to our efforts to help reunite families who were separated as a consequence of the zero tolerance policy under the Trump administration in 2018. What is really interesting, I think in the months that transpired afterwards, is that there continued to be movement and additional families making that dangerous journey in hopes to be able to seek asylum. And it really, it got me to thinking, and I was actually granted an opportunity to travel to Guatemala and actually try to understand, like, what are some of the what are some of the key elements that are actually driving folks to migrate north. And what was really interesting to me was actually the absence of what people would describe as climate change. However, one of the key themes that was made apparent to me is that within Guatemala itself, there is massive internal displacement that has been happening for a number of years. I think both qualified between, the kind of violence and level of corruption, if you will, but also that, there ultimately have been really fundamental changes within the climate in Guatemala that have led to massive droughts and as a result, for folks who relied on agriculture as a means of living, forced to migrate outside of those rural areas and try to find within those urban centers, some form of economic sustainability. However, that internal displacement coming into these urban centers, what I noted is that ultimately that means an increasing competition for the kinds of economic opportunities that are there. And once folks realize that, it's already too late. And so that becomes a driving factor for the way in which people come to these decisions to ultimately say, if I can't find work here, then I have to figure out a way to sustain myself. And so, I think that the key piece here is that just really that it feels like it still is like between the lines of how people would describe their own circumstances and situation. I don't think that folks would automatically peg that climate is like their ultimate driving factor to make that trek north. However, when you have these conversations with people, it becomes evident that that climate change was one of many that ultimately led to their journey. And I think in terms of to your point, Kara, or your question around how would we anticipate climate change to increase the speed or become an increased factor for migration in the future. I think about this even in the context of within the past year. I think one of the most obvious points was the recent hurricanes Eta and Iota, which really devastated Guatemala and Honduras, and already in what has been a very, very hostile environment towards anyone migrating into the U.S. under the previous administration. I think that piece of it really compounded, I think, an existential question that a lot of advocates and a lot of policymakers are coming to, which is how do we actually re-envision what our asylum system is, and how are we factoring in climate change as one of the conditions that could facilitate an asylum process or facilitate a grounds for someone to be able to claim that asylum. And I think one of the things that's kind of really been center of mind for me, and I really welcome my colleagues on this panel to also chime in, but thinking about the commitments that this Biden administration has made to undo the harms of the previous administration and to re-envision the asylum system as a whole. And ultimately, it's our hope that in conjunction with re-envisioning that asylum system, that we can also open up other pathways for immigration that can also help to bring the kinds of economic support to those countries who are faced with this challenge of climate change and ultimately their people being able to give them the ability to, have a visa, have access to work in the United States can ultimately go a long way, I think, in helping through, in helping to also economically support some of those countries. So that's a little bit of a nutshell of like, I think where I have seen climate change impact many folks, primarily in Central America, and also would just love to just continue figuring out like how an organization who's committed to immigration and sort of in this like greater discourse and dialogue, how do we be better at communicating how climate change is a real factor in what is not just a regional phenomenon, but a global one.
Absolutely, Susie. And that, I think, for all of you tuning in who are members of the Truman National Security Project, I think that is a conversation we will commit to continuing among our group. I do want to sort of continue with the theme here of the human impacts of climate migration. And really, Dr. Bronen, given your work on the ground in Alaska, I want to briefly turn back to you to give us some examples. You highlighted just some of the changes, the climate changes that are being realized in Alaska. And one thing you've mentioned before, and I think would be good for our attendees to hear as well, is that climate migration, unlike sudden catastrophic natural disasters, climate change will bring about disasters arising from a slower, more ongoing environmental change. But that change is being seen now, and Susie just talked about that. And in Alaska, you are seeing that more acutely. I was starting to write it out phonetically, and then you started to spell it, so I didn't quite get the term that you referenced earlier, but the catastrophic land collapse. Creating a new word to describe that. So I'd like to hand it back to you, Dr. Bronen, to just give some maybe concrete examples of how this slower ongoing environmental change is being seen in Alaska today.
Yes, thank you. And I want to go back to what Susie talked about in the beginning about the way that I reference our laws in the United States are that our laws are anachronistic to the way that the climate crisis is affecting everything about the way that we live. And Susie mentioned one of the ways. The other ways, and this is within the United States, is what you were just mentioning about the fact that the Stafford Act is the federal legislation that governs FEMA, disaster response, hazard mitigation, and money. Most importantly, the money that comes to assist communities respond to extreme weather events. And slow ongoing environmental change, such as sea level rise and erosion, are not part of that definition that allows that funding to be released. And that is a giant gap. That was part of the reason we worked with Indigenous communities to identify UStek, to elevate it to beyond this slow ongoing environmental change. And to connect it to the profound impact that it's having on the habitability of places. And so, so one of the communities that I've worked with now for over 15 years, it's a community called Newtok, Alaska. Newtok, spelled Newtok, has been in the news for at least 20 years because the tribal government of Newtok identified actually in the 1990s, last century, that they were no longer going to be able to stay where they were. And so their tribal elders identified places where their community could relocate to and maintain the things that were important to their culture and heritage. The tribal elders identified a relocation site, which is actually just 9 miles across a river from where Newtok currently is located. The tribal government hired a lobbyist in the beginning of this century. It took 8 years. Actually, it was last century because it was in the beginning of this century that Congress actually authorized a land exchange between the tribe and U.S. Fish and Wildlife, because it was U.S. Fish and Wildlife land. That happened in 2003. I began working with the tribe soon after that. They were working with, and I am not kidding, 25 different state and federal government agencies. And I'm not going to list them all, but you might imagine. I mean, FEMA, of course, was one of them. HUD was one of them. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And all of them in 2005 said this tribe has to relocate by 2012. Has to, because they are in a humanitarian crisis and they cannot be where they are beyond 2012. We are now in 2021, and 1/3 of the community was able to relocate in 2019. 2/3 of the community, which is approximately 250 to 300 people, are still in this very, very dangerous place. And those state and federal government agency representatives understand what I've just said. They've worked really hard to relocate the community. And they've also said, we have no idea when the remaining members of the Newtok tribe will be able to get to safety at their relocation site. So I mention that because we do not have the governance framework in place, which is why my work with the tribes is to create a governance framework that identifies like the point in time when a relocation effort needs to begin, which is why this connecting slow environmental change with extreme weather events is so important. And a relocation of not only Indigenous peoples, but any like large scale community takes years. So you can't have like an extreme weather event that displaces people and people are in crisis and then wondering how they're going to be fed and how they're going to have their kids go to school. You can't have that be the indicator to then start a multi-year relocation process. We need to be thinking before people are displaced, how to facilitate their relocation to protect their human rights, right? Because if their human rights aren't protected, what the research shows is that they will suffer in the relocation process. So I share all of that, and the tribes have done a giant amount of advocacy, giant. President Obama came to Alaska because of their advocacy. And he mentioned several times the urgency of addressing this issue, and we still haven't addressed it. And clearly we had 4 years where nothing was done. But now the Biden-Harris administration really needs to step up and take this on before more communities in the United States are faced with this awful decision.
I couldn't agree more. And on the note of community, I want to turn to CIDRs, because one unique consideration of climate change and of the challenge we're talking about this evening is how to move entire communities of people at unprecedented levels. This is something, again, as Dr. Brennan's highlighting, we're seeing this happen, but this will become something we are dealing with on a much greater scale. And so, CIDRs, you along with several colleagues reviewed 40,000 voluntary buyouts of flood-prone properties in the United States. What did you find in that review? What types of communities were likely to accept buyouts? Did communities relocate to less flood-prone areas? Please, would love to hear more about your research.
Yeah, so the United States, so we do tend to talk about managed retreat as though it's something that's happening, or climate migration or climate displacement as though it's something that's happening elsewhere, right? For those of us living in Delaware or DC or wherever you're calling in from, the truth is it's probably happening very close to you. So this is happening everywhere and pretty much everyone is affected. So one of the things that's happening in the United States, though, is that we aren't very good at community relocation, as Dr. Bronen has been describing. Like we're very bad at moving people as communities. And part of this goes to our very individual sense of property rights, right? Our very old British law version that I own property, and so I as an individual have a say in my land, as opposed to thinking about us as a collective. So at least for the last 30 years, we've had formal federal programs that go in after disasters. They provide funding to local and state governments, then the local and state governments offer to purchase flood-prone homes from homeowners who want to move. And there's all kinds of debate over how much people want to move in these, but that's the idea anyways. They're voluntary, right? People who want to get out can. And so we did an analysis of looking at all of these buyouts from particularly FEMA. HUD also runs a big program, but we looked at FEMA's because their data is more available. And I think what surprises people is that we found that buyouts have been used in every state but Hawaii. And they've been used in over 1,100 counties. So that's roughly 1 in 3 counties in the United States. So really, to anyone listening, like when I say it's happening near you, I really mean it's happening near you. It's happening in your state, unless you're listening from Hawaii, and it's happening probably in a county near you. So this isn't some mythical future thing, and this isn't some far away, thing that's happening. This is affecting the communities you live and work in. This has been going on. I mean, this particular federal program we looked at has existed since 1989. It really took off in the 90s when we saw lots of river floods in the Midwest. And now we see more relocations happening on the coasts because we see more hurricanes and more storms there. So we're seeing this happen all over the place, but we're seeing it happen at very small scales. So the buyouts that make the news are big ones. Houston has bought out several thousand homes over the last few decades. New York bought out several hundred homes at its time after Sandy. So we see these large buyout programs in the news, but most of the buyout programs that are happening are a community who goes in and buys 10 homes. So they've helped 10 homeowners out of a whole town decide to move away from the river or from the coast. And so it's happening, but it's happening at a small scale, and very few people talk about it. So we have about 1,100 counties that have done buyouts, and we have at least academic research on about 20 of those buyout programs. So the disparity between what has happened and what we know about is really big. And it's important because the ones that we're studying are these really big, prominent buyouts. There's very little research on these smaller buyouts that are happening all over the United States. And so in terms of where do people move, I don't know. And I wish I could tell you, like, we don't know that because what I know is there's data from 2 out of 1,100, right, programs, 2 buyout programs have had research done on where people moved afterwards. And those were in Houston and New York, which, housing pressures in New York are not exactly representative of the rest of the United States. So it's hard to draw conclusions from that about what people might face after buyouts. And so this is problematic because buyouts are happening and they're happening all over the United States, but we're not talking about them. And we really need to talk about them because we don't have a governance structure, because it's not clear that we've been doing them well. It's not even clear how we define well in this context. It's not clear, like, we don't know where people have gone. We don't know how they fared afterwards. We don't know what kind of housing they found. We don't know how it affected their, social connections. We have, like I said, a few studies, but this is really an area where we need to know a lot more. And we know they're really difficult to do. So we know that that's happening. That's a problem. And we know that they're probably going to have to happen more. The National Climate Assessment suggests that retreat in the future will become unavoidable. That's the word they use, unavoidable in all but the lowest sea level rise scenarios. So the National Climate Assessment is projecting the United States will need to do more retreat, and we are not prepared for that. And to think more about the human aspect of this, right? We hear a lot of stories about people who don't want to sell because they get into the newspapers, right? I won't leave, I'll sell my house over my dead body, those kinds of things. So they end up getting quoted. But we're starting to see more stories from people who bought a flood-prone home and wish they hadn't, right? I would never have purchased it if I'd known that it had flooded. Or, one of the stories from Houston that breaks my heart is about a family whose children have PTSD after experiencing major hurricanes. They cry every time it rains because they're so scared of experiencing another hurricane like that. And they can't sell their home because they can't find someone who's willing to buy it for the amount that they paid, and they can't take the financial hit. And so you have families like this who are stuck, right? They want to leave, they want to sell, and frankly, they don't want to sell to another family and just put another family in the same position they're in, right? So they want to do something better. And if we don't have buyout programs, we're not giving an option. So I think we need buyout programs because we need to give options for people like that who are stuck. And the last thing I'll say is that we also need buyouts to think about because we are still actively building in the floodplain, and we are building faster inside the floodplain than we are outside of the floodplain in most of the United States. So we are actively making this problem worse with no plan for how we're going to help these people in the future, either how we're going to protect them in place or how we're going to help them move. And that, I think, is irresponsible, negligent, and just horrific.
Those are
not to try to oversell it.
No, it's good for everybody to understand the magnitude of this problem and the fact that, again, part of the value of today's conversation is shining a light on this, because this is continuing as we're speaking. And should it be? And how can we make sure that we're elevating this conversation, taking action? And so that actually, I think, leads to a really nice transition over to Mark. Before I get into my question for Mark, I want to remind everybody listening in, use the Q&A. A lot of good conversation, a lot of good points have been made. Pop any questions you have into the Q&A. We will be getting to them shortly. So with that, Siders, you set us up really nicely for us to transition to Mark, who I'd like to have give us a sense of the current landscape. You know, we've talked to Mark about climate migration, what it is, why it requires our attention now. Again, Siders teed us up really well. And while we can address some of the impacts of climate change. So with that, and Dr. Bronen, you mentioned the Biden-Harris administration. So with Mark, with this kind of lead up here, how is the Biden administration looking to address this challenge? Give us a sense of that landscape.
Yes, absolutely. And if I could just briefly respond to what Dr. Bronen and Dr. Sider said, just to echo, we do not have a governance framework to govern climate migration, manage retreat, both domestically or internationally. And I just want to say that Dr. Siders, we can maybe include this after, she really is doing the cutting edge work in the academic world on managed retreat within this nation. And it's very interesting to see how our systems in place are quite antiquated for what is a world that has not been climate destabilized. And so, you know, our flood program, we actually incentivize building and climate zones, flood zones, and we are not transparent about the information and exposure to climate risks there. And the Stafford Act, as Dr. Bronen mentioned, actually can perpetuate a cycle of destroy, rebuild, repeat, and re-rinse. So it's not a good legal structure. Not only do we not have a governance structure, we'll be positive towards the end of this panel, I promise, but we are actually incentivizing behavior that exposes people to climate risks. So how is the Biden administration doing? They're doing a few things. The one thing I would say is that they're sort of shifting the climate battleship. You know, President Biden campaigned on one of the 4 crises facing America: racial justice, the economy, COVID, and he was right there with climate. And so you're starting to see that percolate down to certain executive orders. There was an executive order signed in February of this year on refugee resettlement, which followed President Biden's announcement that he's rejoining the Paris Climate Accord. And there is a requirement for the National Security Advisor to report to the president about this climate change migration nexus and some certain tasks within that executive order that Jake Sullivan owes to the president sometime around July of this year. So I know everyone will have a calendar invite for July this year and download that report and look at that report. And so I think for some people, this may have fell short of what they were expecting. I think it's sort of early to be seen about how this executive order follows the report and is actually implemented. Climate change, I will say, is throughout the Biden infrastructure plan and COVID relief plan. And so you're starting to see funding follow some of these efforts. There's also a major executive order on climate change where I would say Biden is using people as policy. Former Senator Secretary of State John Kerry is the special presidential envoy for climate. And he has sort of a leading role in the climate migration piece. There's a piece for him in that executive order. And there's also been an interim national security strategy released where climate change is highlighted numerous times. Climate migration is mentioned as well. And so you're sort of seeing the shifting of the battleship, executive orders, people as policy. You know, looking ahead, I'm definitely interested in seeing this climate migration report that's due out this summer. And I'm looking to see if it builds momentum internationally to have a broader discussion about international governance, about climate migration for Glasgow Conference of Parties 26, which is in November of this year. So I still think it remains to be seen how this sets up future implementation and addressing some of these issues we're talking about today. But I think all eyes will be on Glasgow in November of 21 because we haven't been, the United States was not in the Paris Accord, was in the process of withdrawing from the Paris Accord. and there was not a COP 26 last year because of COVID. So there's a lot of energy, a lot of emphasis, at least on the international environmental migrant, climate migrant front on that date. So those are the things I'll be looking for.
Thanks, Mark. I think that certainly gives us a lot to look forward to, and gives us all some good focal points as we look at the path ahead. So thanks for that. Seeing some questions coming into the Q&A, keep them coming, because we are about to wrap up with the moderated panel portion with a final question that I'm going to pose to all of our panelists. And that is that tonight's conversation, we're not diving into some of the solutions that we've sort of teed up and have been sprinkled throughout our conversation. So instead of diving into solutions, I'd like to ask each of the panelists to briefly speak to this question. As you think about your work, whether it's in the field or it's research, what are the questions or topics that you will explore to further understand climate migration and possible solutions? And I open the floor to any of you to respond first.
Well, I would say, what I want to happen is the Biden-Harris administration address what Dr. Siders and I have been talking about, because the best way for the Biden-Harris administration to address the cross-border movement of people is to identify a governance structure for the internal movement of people. Because that doesn't exist anywhere in the world. Governments are extraordinarily reluctant to manage the internal movement of populations. So the best thing that we could do is identify how to do that and how to do that well using the research that Dr. Siders has mentioned, because clearly the buyout program is one small piece of it, very inadequate. But there's so much work that needs to be done in this country in order to be able to assist other countries deal with the mass movement of people as the land on which they live becomes uninhabitable or permanently disappears because of sea level rise.
I'd sign on to that agenda. I think we absolutely need that in the United States to think about how we do this well. One area I'm particularly interested in this is how we think about what's fair, or how we think about fairness and equity, justice, whatever other word you'd like to use in that space. When we think about climate adaptation, right? Like, where does the seawall get built? Who's behind the seawall? Who relocates? Who pays for these things? These are questions we don't have good answers to, or rather, lots of people have answers to, but lots of people have very different answers to. And it's not clear how those different answers are playing out. And so I think this is an area where we have to think really carefully. We talk a lot about a just transition for, say, like coal miners to transition into new, jobs. We also really need to think about what a just transition looks like for a community who's relocating. How do you think about relocating people in a way that doesn't disrupt, or that doesn't perpetuate historic inequalities, that doesn't exacerbate them or make them worse, or doesn't create new ones? So I think that kind of just transition is going to be really important. And then along with that is something that we don't do well in our country at all, and we also need to figure out how to have a conversation around, is this idea of degrowth, that some places may not be growing in their population, or maybe shouldn't grow in their population forever, right? And so how do we have a conversation about that? Historically, when places have lost economy or whatever, we just end up with a rust belt, right? We end up with hollowed out towns. We don't proactively try to do something to help people manage that degrowth process. And so this is an area where I'm struggling with this because we don't even have the language to talk about it in a good way. And I think we're going to have to think more about that as we help people transition away from risk-prone areas to maybe less risk-prone areas. How do we talk about degrowth in a way that enables a just transition rather than just abandoning people to a hollowing out town?
Yeah, I co-sign with that as well, Dr. Siders, and this notion of climate disinvestment is a very, very difficult challenge. And the two questions that I'm thinking about now is, what is the broader responsibility of wealthier communities that can be within the United States or wealthier countries to assist poorer nations and poorer communities, both at home and abroad. So as I mentioned in the beginning, one of the cruel tragedies of climate change is that the communities that lack the resources oftentimes to adapt to climate change are the least responsible for causing the underlying problem of greenhouse gas emissions, climate change, and impacts. And internationally, this is quite existential for some nations. We talk a lot about domestic in this panel, which is very, very important. But there's scientific studies emerging that there's 4 nations, at least at last count, that may be uninhabitable by mid-century. So broader questions of climate justice, environmental justice, where will they go? Who will pay for the relocation? How will they be relocated? These are amazingly important, both legal, ethical, and moral questions. And the second thing I think through is a lot of the discussion is very serious, and it is correctly a very delicate discussion because in part of the history of migration in this nation, some of it forced migration from the Native Americans, some of it was legally forced migration by the Great Migration of African Americans from Jim Crow South to the North. I do think we have to start thinking about opportunities, both in managed retreat and migration, in part because the global North, the United States, parts of the EU are facing demographic challenges. And so as we start thinking about how to frame the issues, there are certainly opportunities to be had. That's a very delicate discussion to be had. But that's a question I'm thinking through now is how do we start? There's other problems as well. And maybe some of the migration we're seeing can help solve some of those demographic problems in the global North.
And I think on my end, maybe what I'm going to say is going to sound a little counterintuitive to what my other panelists here have mentioned, but I think actually runs within a lot of the same themes that that I've heard posed as questions. At least from where I'm positioned and in our organization, we are in coalition with both national level policymakers, with legal service providers who are doing the direct legal representation for people seeking asylum, and the humanitarian partners who are absolutely critical and essential to give people the kinds of basic needs and support to sustain both their weight in Mexico and to help them transition into the receiving community. And we're actually grappling with a lot of the questions of, how do you figure out how to justly transition people once they arrive to their receiving community. The other question here writ large that I think we've been faced with is how do we re-envision this asylum system to also be one that is not punishing people for having to make these hard decisions to move and leave their country and leave everything that they've known behind. What we have is an immigration system that is focused in a very punitive way, enforcing our immigration laws. And part of the efforts that we have been deeply entrenched in is especially namely through the ways in which the Biden administration is working with NGOs along the border to help unwind and undo this horrendous Remain in Mexico policy, re-envision what it means to actually move away from a detention first posture as it relates to our borders, and move towards the kind of sustainable case management that we see can be successful within the refugee resettlement community, and how do we holistically think about the ways that we support those receiving communities and actually have the full kinds of wraparound services to have a posture of welcoming people in first, and seeing people for their human, as human beings first and foremost, and also the potential human capital that brings to a community. And so I think for me, the question is how do we do that re-envisioning, and how do we sort of update it and really revitalize what are decades old laws that are on the books. You know, some of these laws are as much as like 50, 60 years old. We're in a very different time than the 60s or 70s, and so we are way overdue, and you know, to really come with the solutions, and have a system that lends itself to flexibility, and reflects the current moment, reflects, you know, not just these critical climate change factors, but also from an economic lens, a sustainability lens, and as Mark just mentioned, what does that look like in terms of like our own demographics of our communities across the country.
Thanks all. So we've got about 6 minutes remaining, and I'm going to open it up to a couple of questions. I do want to thank Siders. If folks haven't noticed, or if you haven't opened up your Q&A box, some of the questions that have been coming in, she has answered. And so if you want to just take a look at some of those answers, you can walk away with some even more great information. But
well, answered. I think a lot of these questions are unanswerable, but I've provided some of my thoughts anyway.
There you go. So yes, some thoughts, we'll say. But so what I'm going to try to do here, in the interest of time, I'm going to take the 2 questions that remain and open them up to our panelists, and then we can try to wrap it up on time this evening. And again, any questions that folks had and they didn't pop into the Q&A box, keep them. We're going to continue the conversation. So I think the first question is really focused on kind of climate migration and why people leave a given place. But and here Brendan Johnson is mentioning Michigan, that in Michigan there's growing consensus that they will likely become a prominent long-term climate refugee, especially considering access to world's largest freshwater basin. And so, you know, at the same time, folks in Michigan will tell you how horribly the infrastructure is. So what needs to happen to convince potentially or typically reactionary policymakers to prepare to receive people, or will we even need to in the Great Lakes region? So I think some interest in Great Lakes, but then also I think more broadly, just how can communities be ready to receive? And then I think that also helps to get to the next question, which comes from Jay Bologna, or Bologna. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your last name. But you know, the question here from Jay is that, do any of the panels have examples of communities that have begun to prepare for the arrival of climate migrants, and efforts that might be emulated to take them on in a way that's both supportive of the migrants and also not disruptive for the host communities? So again, if we want to talk about Great Lakes or more broadly, just how can you convince policymakers that this is a thing? And then how do you prepare communities to become helpful recipients of climate migrants?
Yeah, if I could just add, so I think that those are great examples of another reason why we need a national framework, because if places believe that they are going to be able to remain habitable in a climate altered world, we need the science to verify that. Like, what does it mean? Because there's water, but what about heat? What about drought? I mean, it's not just one climate hazard. We need to be thinking of the whole. And that's why there needs to be this national governance framework to identify places where people could go to. And in doing that, build the infrastructure that will be needed for the increased population, right? It's a really complex issue that can't be resolved by communities doing it on their own. We need to have federal leadership, state leadership, and then local leadership to make it possible for people who are reluctant to leave their homes to know where they would be able to go. And the last thing that I would say, it's not just about the infrastructure, it's also about livelihoods. So what are the jobs? What are the employment? You know, what's employment like in people's communities? And will the people coming in be able to have livelihoods to sustain themselves in the communities that they're moving to?
Others want to add?
I think this is a really complex question. To Brendan in Michigan, I'm actually from Duluth, Minnesota. I don't know if any of you have seen news coverage recently of Duluth as a climate haven. And just today, actually, I saw an article in the Duluth News Tribune, a snarky article about why Duluth is not a climate haven. So it's definitely an interesting debate about where people are going to go. I think this is a really, you're right. It's about livelihoods as well as about infrastructure. It's also, it's interesting to think about the reasons people pick where they live, right, are really complicated. Like very few people pick a place to live because of one thing, right? I live where I do because of jobs and family and, my preference for climate and activities that we wanted and negotiations with a spouse or with other people, right? So there's all kinds of complicated things that go into this. And so it's very difficult to say people should move here and here's what we do about that. But I think this is an open area for lots of research. There's some really cool projects, not that I'm involved in, but I know other people involved in who are looking at things like what exactly connects people to where they live and which of those things are replaceable, right? Like that you want to live in this exact place, okay, maybe not, but that you want to live near a hiking forest and in a town with a good brewery or coffee shop or something like that. Okay, maybe we can find that. How do we facilitate those kinds of things? And then how do you scale that up? Right? Maybe you can do that for a small community, but how do you do that when you start talking about thousands of people, right? Or potentially millions of people, even in the United States, who might need to move eventually. And I think this is an area where we're going to need a lot more work, but I think it'll be worth it if we can start having some really difficult conversations about these areas that are going to grow and the areas that aren't.
Well, Mark, Susie, unless you want to add one quick thing, each of you, okay? Saying Mark, saying no, Susie?
The thing that I find interesting, so I failed to mention that I grew up in Arizona. And so, thinking about like the ways in which like frequency of rain, monsoon season, the way that those things transpire when I was growing up versus what they look like now. Like no one really had a word for what folks now hear of as like a haboob, these major dust storms that will often roll through Phoenix and the rest of the valley. But one of the things that I find interesting is I love the heat, I love dry, I love sunshine. I also know that the ways in which urban planning is played out here in this area have really lent itself to vulnerabilities in these areas that have already been susceptible to drought. We're actively competing for a lot of the resources like water that runs through from the Colorado River, some of that which then gets like siphoned off into Los Angeles County. And so it's always like conservation is always like a topic of conversation here. But one of the things that I find interesting is the ways in which Arizona has been sort of a funky place where people also test out some interesting things. And one of the things that I'm reminded of in this conversation is Arco Santi, which this prominent architect who had started sort of thinking about how do you build ecologically sound structures and self-sustaining communities in that way. And so I also wonder, and this is just me like literally shooting out of like left field, right? But what are the ways that we can like also continue to incentivize what it means for developers and urban planners and city governments, state level, like to incentivize the kind of sustainable living that's needed, that can provide, the balance of like the kinds of amenities that maybe younger professionals look for, that families look for, and ultimately, think about like the fundamentally think about community in a way as that we are all dependent on one another's success versus, I think the kind of consumer culture that that we all sort of live and breathe by virtue of being in the U.S.
Thank you, Susie. With that, I want to say thank you to our panelists. Thank you to all of you who've attended. Thank you to the Truman National Security Project, to Camille. And please, if you enjoyed tonight's conversation, we hope you'll tune in to the next one and spread the word to others. So look for more very soon on part 2. Take care, everybody. Have a great night.